a lot about death. And when you do get older, you think of all your sins and just which direction you're going to go in. But that's been bothering me because I'm getting old. In January, I read in the paper where the Pope Benedict has given a blessing for all people that have helped with the people that have leprosy. So I figure with the blessings of the Pope, I'm going to straight shot. The whole business of Pentecost Island started with one man by the name of Frank Pina. Frank Pina lived in Harwich, and in April 1904, he was diagnosed as having leprosy by a man by the name of Dr. Edmonds. That was in April. In May, 2 other men were diagnosed with leprosy, both Chinese in the Boston area. And then again, there was a Portuguese sailor that was diagnosed as having leprosy. And at that point, the eastern Massachusetts was terrorized. We have never seen anything like it in this country, in this part of the country. We don't know fear. What the people of Massachusetts were in terrible straits. They were afraid of an epidemic of leprosy, and they demanded that these people be taken care of in an isolated area. I use words of the period. Some of them people don't like the words, but they are. I'm a historian. I deal with history. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was forced by the people to open a colony for lepers. And we did have a leper colony. In the town of Brewster on Cape Cod, the state bought a farm, and they decided that that's where they're going to put a leper colony. But Cape Cod was just beginning to be a resort area, as well as the coast of Rhode Island. And the governor of the state had a hearing, and 2 of the people in Brewster and in Boston, and there was so many people that went to that hearing that they had to put a special train on from Provincetown to Boston. More people attended that hearing than any other hearing they'd ever had in the state. As a result, they decided not to put the colony in Brewster because they said Brewster was overpopulated. They had a residency of about 400 people at that time. That was in 1904. So they went and then they looked over the Elizabeth Islands. The Elizabeth Islands off the coast of New Bedford is the best way of putting it. It's 8 miles out of New Bedford, 14 miles out of Falmouth. So they looked at all the islands, and they decided that Pentecost, which was then a turkey farm, that would be a very good place to put these patients that have leprosy. And all hell broke loose. They had posters out, they had all kinds of signs, and everything, but the governor refused to have a hearing because he knew what he went through before, and he wasn't about to go through that again. So in November 17th, 1904, Frank Pina left his house in a carriage driven by a horse, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, his family tells me his wife wasn't even notified. Frank Pina had 8 children. He lived in a 2-room shack. He was Portuguese. He and his wife came to this country in 1894. He was here for 10 years, and then the result of that 10 years, he had 8 kids. And he also was removed and brought to the New Bedford area. However, during the storm, they couldn't go off 2 Pennakeys, which is 8 miles out. And so they had to sit around and wait for the weather to clear. So Frank Pena spent the night with Isabel Barrows. Isabel Barrows was a woman who had also had leprosy. She and her husband were locked in their house in Marion, Mass, and not allowed to leave for 4 to 6 months because they didn't know what to do with her. They couldn't put her on Gallup's Island, where there were 3 other patients. So they left she and her husband, Napoleon Barrows. They had 2 children. Poor Isabel Barrows talk about the women getting the worst of the deal. She was 27 years old. She had 2 children, 2 young children. She'd been in this country about 3 years. She was immigrated from the Cape Verde Islands. And so she and her husband were locked in the house. Food was brought and put by the door. Her house was guarded by police, basically to keep people away. They were very afraid of fires, and people going around the houses screaming in the middle of the night, burn them out, and that sort of thing would happen. So she was protected by the police. When they found out she had leprosy, they took her 2 children away. They were young. I think one was 2, one was 4. And they took her, that was the first thing they did. And then her husband was sort of a shell fisherman and roused about every daytime work, whatever anybody needed to have done, they kind of told him to do it. So Frank Pena ended up spending the night with her. And Frank Pena, by the way, he was beyond the incubation period of the disease because he had been in this country at least 10 years. And before he was diagnosed, and he was kept in his house in Howard. His 8 children were taken away from him, and his wife was taken away and moved to another town. However, his wife did visit once in a while, so the family tells me. So the people that were involved were the first people that arrived in New Bedford. In New Bedford, there were 3 men that arrived by train from Boston: Goon Lee Dip, Oriental, Chinese. He was a laundryman, and Yi Toy was another laundryman from Duxbury, I believe. And John Roderick was a Portuguese sailor. All these people you had to be a resident of Massachusetts to be put on Pennakeys. And all people that had the disease in Massachusetts that were patients, that had the disease, that were residents, had to go to Pennakeys. If you did not have a residency in this country, in the country, you were automatically shipped back to the country where you came from. Your voting rights were taken away from you. So there were 5 people standing around down in Fairhaven, waiting for the train to leave, waiting for the boat to leave. The 3 that came from Boston had spent the night in what is called the pest house, or the quarantine station in New Bedford. And then they were transported over to Fairhaven, which is just across the river from New Bedford. And then they sat around until about 2 or 3 o'clock. The crowd was watching them, and they were watching the crowd. And so they arrived on Pennakeys by a boat for about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, getting dark. It was raining. And it must have been a very dismal feeling, because here they were, 5 people that never knew each other, speaking 3 or 4 different languages, and they were put on the north side of the island where Massachusetts had built 3 or 4 cottages. But the cottages, there were 2 people assigned to each cottage. Like Frank Pena lived with John Roderick. Isabel Barrows had a cottage by herself with an attendant. The attendant in those days were probably drunks, alcoholics. They were members of they were from the New Bedford poorhouse. But that's the only people they could get to work out there. There was a doctor by the name of Dr. Lewis Edmonds. He was the man that diagnosed Frank Pena as having leprosy. But the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was the first state to have a leper colony. Like the word. And which was quite fortunate, because one of the things, without even realizing what they have done, they protected these people. Because at home, anything could have happened. They could have been burned out, they could have been stoned, they couldn't go out of the house. They had to stay in their houses, they couldn't get any fresh air, and their health deteriorated rapidly. But they had a brand new house. Isabel Barrows also lived in a very small house with her 2 children and husband, but they had good food, fresh air, exercise, and the men were allowed, the people were allowed to go fishing. I don't think any of the women went too much, but the women, they had their own gardens. They had a very good life, except for the fact they had leprosy. And all 5 people that were there on that first day, who have since died. Frank Pina was 37 years old. By the way, your average lifespan at 1905 was about 50. Isabel Barrows was 27. Cooley Dip was 23. And Ye Torrey was about the same. And I don't remember the age of John Roderick. But when they first arrived on the island, they sort of segregated themselves. They'd been removed from their families and their loved ones and put in a little cottage on a little island. Pennakees is about 75 acres. And so after a while, they began to be a little bit socialized and so on, under the regime of Dr. Edmonds. Isabel Barrows was 4 months pregnant when they sent her out. She, that's what if she wasn't much else to do, I suppose, was locked up in the house for 5 months. But she was 4 months pregnant, and she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And it must have been a great to see somebody new, I mean, a whole new birth given on this island where it was just nothing but misery and death, facing death, and to have a baby born. I just hope that they passed out a cigar. I know Frank Pina smoked cigars. Leontine Lincoln Barrows, that's what she named her son. Leontine Lincoln was the man that was in charge of all the children wars of the state. So she was pretty smart. She knew that Leontine Lincoln would take care of his namesake, and they did. So eventually, all 3 children ended up in New Bedford in a Portuguese home. After they were passed around for 3 or 4 years because people didn't want to be having leprous children in their houses, but they were different churches and so on. But finally, a young couple adopted all 3 children, and then proceeded to have 8 of their own. The Leontine Lincoln Barrows, I looked for him for 70 years. I'm sorry, for 25 years. I looked for Leontine Lincoln Barrows everywhere I went, every kind of thing. And finally, in the Cape Cod Times, I looked, and there was Lincoln. There was Leo Barrows looking at me. And the paper said, "Man born on Pennakees Island." And I said, "I'll be damned," and I've been looking for him for 25 years. I called him up. He was in Medford, Mass. He had been, the first thing that happened was he said to me, he didn't know anything very much about his mother except that she had leprosy and was put on an island, and that's about all he knew. So I told him most everything that I knew, and he got kind of upset and broke down, and I almost did too. And the next thing that he said to me, "Do you have a picture of my mother?" And I said, "Yes." And he was thrilled. And so finally I sent it to him. His 4th wife was also hit on feel. And he became a teacher at Bosco School here in Boston area. Yes, he taught English. And because he had gone into a Catholic school in New Bedford, graduated from there, and then he went into the United States Air Force, and through the Bill of Rights, the GI Bill of Rights, he got his degree from Boston University to teach. So there was a man that came out of that pretty responsible position. He's also given the key to the city twice, in the city of Bedford, where he lived. He also told me that he would send his niece down to Pennakeys and put a gravestone on Isabel Barrow's grave, and she did that. Most of the graves out there were not, the old markers had gone and rotted away. And through the Cuttyhunk Historical Society, by the way, Cuttyhunk is a neighboring island right next door to Pennakeys. It's a mile away, and they have a very active historical society who was responsible for the display you saw. And they also have taken over the responsibility of the cemetery on Pennakeys where these people were buried. So Isabel Barrow's got a gravestone. Finally, it was kind of difficult to find where the graves were because most of them were not marked, and I did manage to find a map that mapped out half of them. But after Edmonds, by the way, Dr. Edmonds declared another thing about Isabel Barrows, that Edmonds declared her as cured. She was going to be sent home. Big headlines in the newspaper. That was a mistake. The Board of Health came over and checked, and she did not have the cure for leprosy. And so she spent the rest of her life there on the island. She spent 10 years on Pennakeys, a little 75-acre island. She died at 37. She spent 1/3 of her life on the island. And her husband died in the meantime. He drowned. They think it might have been suicide. That gives you an idea of what one woman's life was like. And if you ever get your own life down, and you just think of poor old Isabel, she's about had it. But that brings you on up to date on that. The Cuttyhunk Historical Society is taking care of the graves, and I have to tell you this, one of the things that we did, we wanted every single person to have a gravestone. And so we went around to different people and raising funds for the graves, for the stones. In one instance, a family brought the stone for them. At 2 instances, a family brought the stone for them. And then I gotta keep track of my time here. I'm told I gotta make it sharp. One of the major things that we did was, when you write a book, by the way, I wrote a book on this subject. When you write a book, once in a while something very nice happens. There was one man that his grandfather was the only man that was allowed to leave Pennakeys Island with visible signs of leprosy. And it took me a long time to figure out how that was done. I got a letter from a man. He says, I've been looking for my grandfather for years and years and years. My grandmother wouldn't tell me what happened to him. My mother wouldn't tell me what happened to him. And we went over to Cuttyhunk and we saw my brother saw your book, and there was my grandfather in your book. And I said, before you go any further, I want to know how he got off the island. And he says, my grandfather had a son that was involved in the mafia. And that's how he got off the island. I said, what happened to him? He said, the family put him in New York State, where it wasn't quite as many severe laws dealing with leprosy. And he died at Carville. Evidently, they sent him to Carville eventually. So that was one of the nice things. But back to the gravestones. Another thing that happened was there was a man from New Haven, Connecticut. He wrote to me and asked me a question about the book. And I wrote back and gave him the answer. I was quite pleased to think that somebody would sit down and write about it. And he wrote back again with another question. And I very nicely went, asked him back again, answered him. And then he emailed me another question. And I emailed him back. And so finally, after the second email, I said, I'm going to fix this guy. I'll shut him up. So I says, the Cuttyhug Historical Society needs money for gravestones. They run about $400 or $500 a piece. Would you like to send one? I said, that's the end of him. Nope. He calls back and he says, yes, but my wife and I would love to buy a gravestone. And I said, here, I gave him the names. And he said, we want to buy one for Iwa Umasaki, who was a Japanese patient. And I said, okay, and what name do you want to put down on the contribution list? And he says, my wife and I. My wife's name is Prithi, and I am George Joseph, the speaker that was going to be here. So he was going to be, so I haven't heard from him since. He was supposed to be here this week, but he's not. Iwa Umasaki was a Japanese patient. He came into this country via Seattle, Washington, and he was probably the most intelligent of all the patients there. These were first generation immigrants, and he was a cabinet maker, and he was found to have leprosy while he was working on Isabel Stewart's Gardner's Museum. And that's where they found him. He was the only man to escape from Pennickese. He rode to Padenham, which was about a 15-mile row. He couldn't have been too sick. And he took a train from Padenham to Boston. And when they found out that he had left Pennickese, all the people that were working in that area, they took all the cars, all the trolley cars off the line, and everybody had to walk home. So they fumigated all the cars. He went to Boston, and he evidently visited the house of ill repute. And then he went to the Japanese embassy and asked to be sent back, and they refused to send him back to Japan. They did not allow anybody to go back into Japan at that time that had leprosy. So they sent him back to Pennickese, and that's where they discovered that he had been to the house of ill repute and had contacted gonorrhea. And he was on the way out. But he was a very intelligent man. He was a Buddhist. And when they buried Iwa, they buried him. He was buried by a New England Baptist minister at Pennickese. So I thought that was quite a combination until later on, and I'll go into that a little later. The other patients that I would like to talk about one is Archibald James B. Thomas. He was the youngest patient there. He was 16. He came from Upton, Mass. He and his mother immigrated to this country from Barbados. The father was with them, but the father was not allowed to come into the country because he had some kind of a skin disease, and they wouldn't allow him in. So Archie and his mother came. He was 9 years old at the time. Archie and his mother came to Upton, where she worked in a hat factory. I think she may have had a little bit of money, more than most, as she was a foreman in a hat factory there. And then Archie was diagnosed as having leprosy, and the doctors in Boston, Massachusetts General Hospital had an awful time to send a 16-year-old boy to an island where he would never get off again. But they had to do it because the law required them to do it. So his mother decided that she wanted to go and take care of him, but they wouldn't allow her to go. Well, back to raising hell again. She was smart. She went to the press and told them that all of this great yellow journalism that they still do. She was able to convince the Board of Health that she could go back there, and she didn't care whether she got leprosy or not, as long as she was taking care of her son, her only child. And so after many months, they finally decided that it was all right to send her back there, provided that she was hired as a nurse. She was hired as a nurse to make $5 or $10 a day a week. And she went over there and she took care of her son. He died, he lived there, he lived for 6 more years. He died at age 22. He was probably the most popular, one of the most popular patients there. He had a radio operating set, and he was in contact with all the ships and shipping that went by. He was with the telegraph sets. The Women's Club of New Bedford bought him a radio set for that purpose. So his obituary even made the London News, London Times. But he was 22. He had this one article. When you saw the pictures of the hands being claws, and that's what Archie had, the kind of deteriorated the whole entire body. I think there are 3 kinds of leprosy: one tubercular, lepromatis, and the combination of both. Frank Pena, back to him for a minute, he had 2 grandsons that came to me and wanted to talk about his grandfather because they didn't know too much. And they also bought a gravestone for Frank Pena. But one of the sons came to my house with his daughter, who would have been the great-granddaughter. And she said to me, if I came in contact with people with leprosy, would I catch leprosy? And she was a beautiful girl. And I said, if I were you, I wouldn't marry one, because I feel that it's a lack of something in the genes. I don't know the correct terminology. And it runs in families. And so if she had a family record of leprosy, perhaps she would she could hang around with him, but I don't think she would marry one. I gave a talk in Harwich, and the other grandson showed up with his wife, and they were quite interested. And she also told me that, and I did not know that when Frank Pena was taken away, before he was taken away, the town of Harwich, this is a fine example of stigma. The town of Harwich took all the Portuguese children and put them in a separate school. And they were segregated. We don't know how poor, we're not aware of how poor the world was at that particular time. Cape Cod was not a wealthy place. Frank Pena lived in a little tiny house, 8 people, 8 children. Isabel Barrows lived in a small house. They were shacks, is basically what they were. There was no sewerage. It was just very, very low income. There was no welfare. The only help you ever got was from your church or from your friends. Either that or you just dropped dead. The Irish were dying all over the city of Boston, starving to death. It was a filthy area. Sewerage, there was no sewerage systems. I often wonder what happens to those 3-story walk-ups when you have to go to the bathroom. I've never been able to find out that in cities. Also, just as a little side effect to tell you what it's like to live in the city in Boston, the city of Boston in 1900 had 8,000 horses. One horse produces 25 pounds of excrement a day. Multiply that by 8,000 horses. You couldn't walk down the street. But we don't see that. But that's what the world was like in those days. But it's not too much aware of it now because we've lost that all over. Another patient that we had out on the island was, her name was Bertha Osis. Bertha Osis was a Russian Jew. She was 19 years old when she was declared to be a leper. She was sent to Pennakees to find out whether or not she had leprosy for sure, because she was so young and it was not too visible. She was put on the island for diagnosis. But Bertha Osis did not have a citizenship in Massachusetts. No, she hadn't been in long enough in the country to get citizenship anywhere. But she stayed on Pennakees for about 4 months before they had to they diagnosed her and they had to send her home. She was shipped from Pennakees, brought to New Bedford, and from New Bedford she was sent to New York by a boat. When they had the boat they put her on from New Bedford was a fairly sizable boat. She was the only passenger. Nobody would get on the boat with her. When she arrived in New York Harbor, there was a whole flotilla of boats that wanted to see the girl leper. And she was on the deck, and all the crew was screaming at her to get downwind. She had to keep keeping downwind of all these little crew there was. When she left New York, she was put on the same boat that she came over into this country on. That was required if at all possible. And she was the only passenger. They took off most of the freight and most of the crew left. They wouldn't have nothing to do with it. So she went over with just a skeleton crew and very little freight. That was to make the shipping companies more careful as to who they brought into the country. It was a very, very expensive deal for them. She was also a friend of Lucy Peterson. Lucy Peterson was another Russian Jew, and she was an immigrant. She lived in Brookline. She was a maid. She was about 28, I think, when she was diagnosed with leprosy. But she could speak English, one of the few people that could speak English. At times on Pennakees, when there was at least 15 patients, they were speaking at least 6 or 7 different languages, which was very difficult for everybody concerned, especially the doctors. After Edmonds declared Isabel Barrows as being cured, he lost his job. He ended up working in the night shift at the Boston Globe. And a man and his wife by the name of Dr. Frank and Marion Parker. They must have been absolutely wonderful people. They came to Pennakees to spend a year. And they spent 16 years. They turned a leper colony into a leprosarium. They had a hospital. They got a hospital going. They had nurses. They had people from medical center at Harvard and Tufts, which was a graduate, but Parker graduated from Tufts. It wasn't Tufts then, it was something else. They brought in magazines in the different various languages. They had a big dining room, and if you caught a fish, the cooks would cook the fish for you, and everybody would get a chance to eat some of your fish. They had tea every Sunday afternoon with their patients. Marion Parker established a post office. If anybody ever comes across a postcard or a letter from that, I would love to buy it. They fumigated the mail. That was one of Marion Parker's job as postmistress. That was the only money she ever received for working out there, was as a she was a postmaster. There's no such thing as a postmistress in the postal department, I was informed. She had a job of fumigating the mail. She would cut the 4 corners off of a sealed letter and put it into a little box, and underneath the box there was sulfur burning. And the sulfur, the smoke from the sulfur was supposed to go into the letter, seal into the letter in the little corners, and kill the leprosy. She was required to do that, otherwise they would never ship it out. I've never seen it. The other patients that I was going to mention to you.
Tom, since we're behind schedule, I wonder if we
Okay,
can...
I got one more, just.
You can buy the book.
What? Solomon Goodman. Solomon Goodman and Morris Goldblatt were two Jewish men. And I had a devil of a job trying to find somebody to get a gravestone for them. I finally got the rabbi from New Bedford to come over, and he and then both rabbis made a effort, and they got the stones, and they came out with the New Bedford Jewish Federation, of which they made me an honorary member. I'm only Irish descent person. I think the devil was involved with. They got that title. Solomon Goodman was a very nice man. He was a very pleasant man. He was a school teacher where he taught Hebrew to the students in Boston. And I can just imagine those Jewish mothers when they found out that the teacher had leprosy. That's about it. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.